Greetings. Welcome to Someone Talked. I'm your host, Dr. John C. McManus from Missouri S&T, and alongside, as always, are my dear friends and partners in mayhem, I'll say this time, April Cheek Messier and John Long from the National D-Day Foundation, D-Day Memorial Foundation. How's it going?
Oh, wonderful. Mayhem continues. Yes. No, but all good. All good.
Good morning. Looking forward to the mayhem.
That's right.
Absolutely. And actually, I think the word is appropriate given the topic we're talking about, Omaha Beach to some extent, but of course, specifically Robert Capa in Omaha Beach. And of course, alongside to discuss that is Charles Herrick, who has written a book called Back into Focus, which is basically a play on words because if you've ever read Robert Capa's memoir, it's called Slightly Out of Focus. So, and it very much, Charles's title is very much attuned to what he is getting after here, trying to put into focus Robert Capa's activities on D-Day at Omaha Beach, which are sort of legendary, but perhaps misunderstood too. Just by way of background, Charles has remarkable military career, a graduate of the United States Military Academy in 1974. He was an infantryman, combat infantry badge, ranger, master parachutist, deployed to Panama, long, very successful military career, graduate of the Army War College, and oh, by the way, a defense contractor too, and now an author, as if he doesn't do enough well. So, Charles, we're really honored to have you today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here. You left out my bad knees, but
yeah, the bad knees are a legacy of everything I just mentioned, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate everything you've done, and we appreciate the work you've done, of course, on your book, Back into Focus. I guess maybe the place to start with this is what got you interested in the topic? How did you come to it?
Well, I kind of backed into it. I mean, I'd always been a little bit suspicious of Capa's photos. Anytime you see a cameraman ahead of the action in combat, it's usually a sign of a staged photo. So Alan Coleman had a project over on his website, Photo Critic International, taking a look at Capa's D-Day experiences. And I submitted a comment over there on something and ended up getting wrapped into it and did several columns examining basically the major points that we're going to be looking at today, and that kind of then evolved into the book. It wasn't planned; it was just a stumbled into it kind of thing.
Yeah. So Robert Capa, you go into his background a little bit, and I think you wanted to kind of start there. Give us an overview of who he was, how he comes to this point, to be a photographer, in this enormous invasion.
Yeah, he's got the reputation of being the world's greatest war photographer, and he did serve in a number of wars, covered them: China, Spanish Civil War twice, almost all the theaters in World War II in the western part of the war. But he was also the head of Magnum Photos. He created that. He covered the foundation of Israel. He was Jewish, and that had great meaning for him. And then he finally died in combat with the French forces in Indochina in 1954. But he was born in Hungary, and he was exiled when he was a late teenager, supposedly because of socialist revolutionary activity. We don't know if that's true or not. He embellished all of his stories. But he did end up in Germany. He studied there in the college for a little bit, ran out of funds, started kicking around, took an interest in photography. When Hitler came to power, he moved to, he eventually ended up in Paris. He had several places in between. Worked more in photography for a couple companies there, newspapers. There he met a girl named Gerda, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name because I don't want to alienate any countries here. But she was his girlfriend, and together they created a fictional character called Robert Capa, and he was supposedly the head of their photo agency. They thought that'd give it more respectability. And Capa posed as the darkroom assistant, but he actually took the photos, and Gerda would go and use her charm to get the photos published. Well, pretty soon, Capa took over the persona of Robert Capa. the fictional person, and Gerda was she changed her last name to Taro, and of course she was quite a photographer in her own right. And they ended up in the Spanish Civil War, covering that very early on. Capa was only about 22, going on 23 at the time, and that's where, on his very first outing, he took the very famous photo of the falling soldier, or the death of the militiaman. Now, that's come to be a very powerful image. He became absolutely famous for it. But when that was originally published in View magazine over in Europe, it was published with a second photo. And that second photo showed a different man dying in almost the exact same position at the exact same location, and very shortly before or after. So it became obvious, if you were over in Europe, that these photos may not be quite what they purport to be. The newspaper, the magazine, passed them off as real combat photos. But if you were alert, you knew there was a problem. Unfortunately, when the Falling Soldier was published in the U.S., they didn't publish the second photo. So the U.S. Readers thought that was exactly what the caption said. And there'd always been kind of a question about its authenticity. Years later, the second photo popped up again, and that kind of reignited the questions. And finally, I think it was 2006, a professor, Spirigi, Jose Manuel Superigi, I'm sure butchering that as well, I apologize. But he set out to find out where the photos were taken. They were supposed to be taken at Cerro Muriano, where the combat was going, the front lines were fighting. But he actually located it to a place called Cerro Espejo, and that was 30 miles behind the lines. And that conclusively proved that this was a staged photo. It was purely a propaganda thing. And if you take a look at all of the negatives in this film set, it's pretty clear that they were running back and forth, staging mock attacks and this, that, and whatnot. And as a result, the very first outing that he did for covering combat was just a fake, and he became famous for it. And even today, there are people who either don't know, don't care, or don't believe that it's faked, and they still consider it one of the great photos of war of all time. And, so that's I guess that's how popular history goes, or popular legends.
Charles, why do you think that was so not challenged at the time, that particular photo? I know we'll get into the Capa photos, the later Capa photos for D-Day, but why was that one not challenged more at the time?
Well, I don't mean to get into politics, but I think a large part of it was a political thing. The revolutionary or Republican forces in Spain were fighting the fascist Franco. You know, that was how that was portrayed. We had the Abraham Lincoln brigades romantically going over there and intervening. And I think the popular perspective amongst most of the arts community and the media community was that this was a good thing. This is a good cause. And so we're not going to look too closely behind the curtain and see what's back there. And ever since then, you know, it's just been a legacy of that.
I mean, there's quite an ethical dimension to this whole thing, from a journalistic standpoint, from a photographic standpoint. You know, it's hard to get really good, candid photos of a combat zone. You know better than we do, of course. But at the same time, you know, there's an artistic license too. And of course, pictures do lie. People say, well, the photos don't lie. Actually, they do, in the sense of misapprehensions and what is misleading and captions that are wrong. And even a photographer may not know what the caption is going to be ultimately. But it seems as though what you're saying is that Capa deliberately was deceptive here in staging the photo, and that's kind of what launches his career. So it begins on a kind of deceptive base point. Is that a correct summation?
Absolutely. Now, and that's different from his D-Day photos. His D-Day photos have been portrayed deceptively by mostly by Life magazine and everybody ever since. But in that case, he was actually there. There were actual events. He was photographing actual events on the ground. So it's not so much that he was portraying things as a lie, although in his later life when he wrote his book, he did weave it into this very fanciful fabric of a story, which was largely fictionalized.
Yeah, I mean that his memoir has to be taken with a great grain of salt, and you make that point in the book very well. I mean, I know from kind of quote using it as a source, you really have to be careful. But he's a vexing figure, honestly, Charles, because he was there. He had certainly a great talent for photography, and he was involved in war events. He ultimately did lose his life in Southeast Asia, and that's not going to happen if he's not there in a combat zone. And yet he also has this really kind of almost crass self-promotional side on some levels too. He really mastered that, didn't he? I mean, he's even the name. I mean, he creates this persona, and I think the book is interesting in that you really kind of delve deeply into who he was. How do you think we should, view his photography as a whole, as a kind of centerpiece of understanding of World War II and as kind of source material? Do you think we discard it? Do you think there's value in it at all? I mean, how do you go with this?
Well, a couple different layers on it. First of all, was he a good photographer? And no, even his friend said, well, he wasn't technically very good, but he was always at the right scene and was able to capture the right image. You look into that and you see how many of those images were kind of staged, and they weren't nearly as far forward as he said he was. So he has a good body of work, but during the war, he was never valued highly enough by any organization to hire him on as a staff photographer. He was just a contract photographer they'd hired on for a few months at a time, and then they'd fire, or his contract would run out, and they'd get somebody else. It wasn't until after D-Day that Life took him on as a staff reporter or a staff photographer. So he did some good work, some interesting photos. You have to kind of look at them very carefully. But he was a master of, I'd call it the shaky cam kind of photos. Lots of blurring to add a dramatic flair and make it seem like more of a sense of action and drama and danger. One of the things, if you don't mind me scrolling very quickly through these slides. Okay, this is one of the first shots he took off the ramp of his landing craft. And again, he only took 10 shots on the beach that day, 5 from the ramp and 5 in the water. And you can see how shaky and blurry this is. Now, by comparison, there was a Coast Guard still photo cameraman by the name of Robert Sargent. And he landed in a wave. Well, he didn't land. He accompanied the landing craft in a wave about 40 minutes before Capa. And they hit the beach just in front of WN 64. As you recall, that's the strong point guarding the east side of the E1 draw. And this company took a lot of casualties during the landing and the subsequent fighting. But you see the quality of his photos. They're very sharp, very clear. Tell a great story. I mean, that's tank dozer number 9, and it's sitting in a clear gap through the obstacles at the beach. I mean, that's a remarkable photo. And if you look over, got to get my mouse moving here. Look over there, there's a little rubber boat that the engineers floated their demo in. The ramp is coming up immediately. You see the guys are on a sandbar here, and as they get closer to the beach, they're actually going deeper into the water, going into a runnel. So to me, that's just a fascinating photo. It tells a lot. It's high technical quality. And this is just a military cameraman who learned his trade shortly before that. So a little bit leery. I think you have to be a little bit leery about the shaky cam impression. It has some emotional appeal, but I'm not sure that it deserves all of the honor and praise that it gets.
I love the Sergeant photo, by the way. It's one we show pretty much every school group when they come up to the memorial for a tour. But let's, and there's so much to your book. I wish we had time to talk about every page, but let's kind of skip into the middle, you make really a lot of very compelling challenges to the Capa legend. But you start with where and when he landed on D-Day. So what did Capa and all of his adherents since then, what did they claim, and what did your research show?
Well, he claimed that he landed in the first wave with Company E. But take a look at this photo here. This photo is one of the first 5 photos he took from the ramp of his landing craft. Now, when Company E landed, they landed 6:30-ish. And the tide at that point was about 200 to 250 yards shy of the obstacles. Well, this picture here doesn't show that at all. In fact, the picture shows that the tide is almost up to the shingle embankment there, probably, I don't know, 50, 75 yards shy of it. And that's exactly where the tide was when Colonel Taylor arrived on the beach with his rear command echelon of the 16th Regiment. And that happened to be the boat that Capa actually was in. So they landed about the 8:20. They landed 15 minutes late. So he landed almost 2 hours after H hour. And I got a tremendous pushback on that. Surely I was wrong. I must be crazy. But, you know, the photos don't lie. All the details are there. And frankly, I'm a little bit amazed that for years that myth of the first wave at Company has lasted, given that all the visual evidence is just the opposite. Now, as of
also
where
the documentary evidence of who was on what ship. I mean, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's just so much confusion there. His biographer was convinced that Capa landed on Fox Green, the next beach sector over. But it's never really sat right. And there's another good researcher, a guy named Peter Ute, and he's a D-Day tour guide and runs a wonderful website with lots of detail. And he'd taken a look at contour matching, terrain contour matching, and he decided that Capa landed on Easy Red. And so when I took a look at that, it seemed like a good solution, but I didn't really have a lot of faith that you could really match contours with the change in terrain and vegetation and whatnot. So I took a look at it a little bit differently. And I went out and found eventually 3 photos that linked Capa's landing site to a known object on the beach. And that was a set of ruins called the Roman ruins by some folks. And so this was one of the 3 photos taken by Lieutenant Boucher. He's a Navy officer serving aboard an LCI. And it had beached a little bit later in the day. And looking off to the right side of the LCI, you can see the Roman ruins there peeking above the shingle bank. And it's outlined in the little white box. Now, to the left side, you see tank dozer number 10, which we've seen throughout the Capa saga. And moving on to the next photo. Next photo is off the left side of that same LCI. And you see 2 standard tanks with deep wading kits. One of them's dragging a M8 armored ammunition trailer. They're reloading their tank, and a duplex drive tank. And we'll see those a little bit more too. But notice first the skyline, the details of the skyline there. And this then is the 3rd photo Boucher took as his LCI was pulling out. As you can see, another distinctive segment of the skyline. So putting those together and then referring back to Capa's photo from the ramp, you see the exact same picture of the skyline. And that pretty much definitely places where Capa landed, probably about 100 yards to the east of the Roman ruins. And that was halfway between the E3 exit and its strong points and the E1 exit and its strong points. And the result of that means that that was a pretty lightly defended area. They just weren't getting much fire. That's where Spaulding's boat section landed, made it up to the crest of the bluffs, followed by Company G, which made it up to the crest of the bluffs almost intact. Between the 2 of them, they fought their way through the bluffs and they then departed on their separate missions. So that was a very key place. And possibly the first penetration of the bluffs, but certainly the most critical. I think they landed 9 more battalions of reinforcing troops that day, and 7 of them mounted the bluffs through exactly that gap there. So
Charles, I have a quick question. So going back to, I mean, I have the deepest respect for anyone who landed on any part of Omaha Beach because I can't even imagine. But you make the point that he really didn't intend on landing on the beach itself. So can you tell us a little bit about what how that happened, and that the fact that maybe he had no actual intention of setting foot in France on D-Day necessarily? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Capa wasn't really, despite what he portrayed, he wasn't really all that anxious to be at the front line of combat. When he got to England, he was first assigned to the U.S. Army Air Forces, and his bureau volunteered him to jump in with the paratroopers on D-Day. He didn't volunteer, and so he just kind of refused to go to jump school. So they ended up reassigning him. I guess he thought he'd be reassigned back to the Air Forces. Instead, they assigned him to the Ground Forces photo pool. 2 guys were in that photo pool on Omaha Beach, and their job wasn't to land with the troops. Their job was to ride in, get initial photos of the landing, ride back in their landing craft, and get the photos on the wire to stateside as quickly as possible. Well, when Capa's boat hit the shore, everybody got out, and Capa stood on the top of the ramp there and started taking pictures. Well, you saw in Sargent's photo how quickly they raised the ramp and were retracting off the beach. The ramp was lightly armored. It's the only protection the crew had, so they wanted to get that up. Well, by Capa's story, one of the crewmen came up and booted him off the ramp. I guess they thought he was hesitating or a coward or whatever. But yeah, he accidentally ended up on the shore. He had not intended to go there. That was not his job. And quite frankly, it kind of unnerved the guy, and you can understand why. He wasn't prepared for it. He wasn't wearing his normal combat kit. He was just there with the camera bag. And you take a look at all his photos from the beach, all 5 of them are pointed offshore. He was looking for a way to get out of there. No photos of fighting ashore. Yeah, and you got to understand that. He in one of his versions of the story, he frankly admitted he had a failure of courage and fled as fast as he could. And that's not a knock on him. I think I would have done that in the same situation.
Well, another interesting point that I think is counterintuitive to a lot of people who know D-Day is you assert that where he landed in front of the Roman ruins, which was the wreckage of a house there just past the beach, but it was much less of a killing zone than other parts of Omaha Beach on D-Day. And again, I don't want to disparage anyone because if they're on Omaha Beach, they're in danger. But yeah, the truth of the matter is there are some parts that were much heavier fire than right there where he was actually landing instead of where he was claiming to land. So unpack that for us and give us a little bit of a description. What was it like for the men around Capa on D-Day?
We have to realize that there were about 100+ men in the wave that Capa landed with. Every single man in that wave waded through the shore or waded through the surf and made it to the shingle embankment without a single casualty, not a one. So that gives you an idea that that was not the bloody killing zone that he portrayed later in it. Gap Assault Team 10 had landed there. If we go back to this photo, you can see their tank dozer right there, and these are the 2 standard tanks with deep wading kits that landed with that team. And they didn't come under fire for the first 20 minutes on the beach. They were able to set up all their demolitions and blow their first shot without receiving a single round of fire from the Germans. It was only after that shot, that explosion went off, that the Germans started paying attention to them. And despite that, they were able to open up an additional double wide lane beyond the one they initially did. That gives you a good idea of just how light the fire was at that place. Now, they did receive fire, but the regimental medical section, which spent all day on the beach treating casualties, they only had one man wounded out of about 20 folks. So that area was I won't say it was a bucolic paradise, and I don't want to say that Omaha Beach was not absolute hell in lots of places. But the German strongpoints were concerned with defending the exits, and that's where their fire was mostly concentrated. And they just had attention for the other areas on a secondary basis. They were trying to conserve ammunition. They were trying to focus where they needed to put the fires. So that part of the beach did not. And that's why Colonel Taylor landed there. He started in almost at Fox Green and said, "Oh, this is not a place to land. I can't do anything to assert control here." So he cruised up the beach until he found a calm spot, which was where he landed. And that was deliberate.
Yeah, if I may, I can give you a little bit of an update because you use some very good statistics in your book. It's about page, 110, 111 or so for the losses of the 16th. And you say that the 81st Chemical Mortar Battalion had 2 men killed on D-Day. On our wall at the National D-Day Memorial, we actually have 9 men from that unit. And the medical detachment, we have 9 men from that unit also killed, including 4 officers. Now, you, of course, were dealing with the beach itself, and I don't know, without doing a lot of digging, exactly what the, where those losses happened. They could have been in the channel before they got to the beach. They could have been later, hours later, past the beach. I don't know, but I don't want to give the impression that these units that maybe had light losses on the beach were unscathed, because again, anyone who's landing on Omaha Beach is facing just a maelstrom of fire.
Absolutely, yeah. I took my figures from the after action reports of that day, and of course, I'm sure in the weeks after that they cleaned those up some.
Right. And of course, we like to brag about this on our podcast. That's the National D-Day Memorial Necrology Project is the only list in anywhere in the world of every man who's been identified as dying on D-Day. And we're still working on that. Still researching.
20 plus years of research and still researching.
Exactly. And in fact, got folders on my desk right now of men that we're considering. And it's
that's tremendous work.
It is, and it's endlessly fascinating, but it's also very important because we want to see that everyone who died on D-Day is recognized and name them individually on our wall.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that's incredible, exacting work with a remarkable blend of source material. And it's amazing how hard it is to pin down, to this day, exactly when somebody was killed. And, this enormous, well-documented event, still to this day, there's unanswered questions, just as there are about Robert Capa, who, sure. That's what's so fascinating about this conversation, Charles, is that, we think we know Capa, and we kind of do, but maybe we don't. And that's sort of the takeaway from your book is you're really delving into the various dimensions of him. It's not just about Omaha Beach. It's about his career on some level during World War II, but also his actions on Omaha Beach. So, as you mentioned, his job is not necessarily to stay there and take pictures. His job was to basically stay aboard one of the boats, take some pictures, and then get out of there and get them on and moved on. And in the book, one of the things I learned that I didn't know, because I'm not, they're well versed on how, the photographers worked in terms of getting their pictures out to the various media sources and all that. You go into some depth about how you really did have to get out of there in order to get the pictures to the various media sources in any kind of timely manner. And so this is a pretty serious issue for him, not, absent the danger once he's on the beach. He could be marooned there, and then it's kind of useless. He's taking these pictures, and they'll never get out, or his camera could be destroyed or whatever. So how long, in your estimation, was he actually on the beach? And then what's the process by which he gets out of there and then gets the photos out to the world?
Well, he landed with Taylor about 8:20 in the morning. He was on LCI 84, the LCI he fled to. when it was hit retracting at 8:50. So at the maximum, he was there for about 30 minutes. Now, judging by the height of the tide in his various photos, the tide rose 1 foot every 11 minutes. So based on his own photos, it looks like he's only taking photos for about 6 minutes at the max. And I think at that point, he then went to LCI 84 right after it beached, and he boarded right at that point. Certainly, he was not on the beach, in my opinion, more than 10 or 15 minutes. Now, the transports are supposed to start hauling their landing craft back up at 10:30 in preparation for a departure about 1 o'clock. So Cap had a very narrow window to get back to his transport to get back to England. So that accounted for his urgency on getting the heck off the beach as fast as he could. So he boarded the LCI 84. That went back to the transport area. He caught another landing craft over to the Chase, USS Chase, Samuel Chase, that he came with. And then that was in a convoy that returned back to the UK. The convoy didn't leave until about 18:30 that night. Everything was delayed that day. Now, they were so anxious to get the photos that the press corps had, or press division had, a plane awaiting in Weymouth for the first guy with film. And Cap was really hoping to make that, get the great scoop. Maybe he'd finally get a staff job. Unfortunately, one of the leading ships in that convoy had a guy named Bert Brandt, who was also in the photo pool. And Brandt had also ridden on a landing craft. He claimed he got out on the beach. His photos don't show it. But regardless, Brandt's ship got into Weymouth earlier, and it unloaded about 2-3 hours before Capa's did. And so Brandt's film got flown to London. Brandt got flown to London, did a series of high-profile interviews, and Capa was arriving at Weymouth pretty bitter about it all. And so he turned around, got on the next ship, and went back to Omaha Beach. The film then went to London. I'll spare you all the details of the censorship process, but it eventually got put on a plane that was a special courier plane that flew to New York, correction, to DC, and then it was couriered up to the Life magazine studios in New York. And it made it on the wire and into the evening newspapers on the West Coast on 7 June. So not too bad. Some of the photos were sent by radio telephoto, available to all the news agencies. But the first ones that made it on the news were the papers in the evening on the West Coast.
So, Charles, I know we've given many tours at the memorial, and we always hear about, people just say, oh my goodness, it's so sad what happened to the Capa photos, the darkroom incident. So let's talk about that for a minute, because for decades the Capa story insisted that his relatively light production of photos on D-Day was due to the darkroom accident. Explain what this was and why this has been reevaluated in recent years.
Well, supposedly the photos, they were good in a big rush to go ahead and develop the photos and get them out. And they turned the photos over to a teenage lab assistant who, in his rush to get them developed, put them in a drying cabinet and turned the heat up quickly. And supposedly the heat caused the emulsion to run and ruined a whole bunch of the film, and blah, 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 blah. Ross Bauman, very prominent photographer. He was the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner in photography in the history of that award. A very distinguished career. But about 2015, he got on Alan Coleman's Photo Critic International website and challenged that. He says, this doesn't make any sense. And the two of them were later joined by Rob McElroy and Kristen DeCuna, and they did a series of experiments using film at the time, heat, immersion in seawater, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and decisively proved that you just can't ruin the film that way. A lot of pushback, a lot of arguments back and forth on that. And the big guy who'd been pushing the darkroom accident theory was John Morris. John Morris was the photo editor of for the Time Life organization in London, and the lab reported to him. And so he'd push this story about, he'd seen what happened, and et cetera, et cetera. And so he fought back against this very hard. But finally, he just had to admit that, yeah, the lab accident story was not true. Capa apparently only took the 10 photos from the beach. And well, that was a good admission, but it didn't really explain then what happened to the rest of the photos. And so that's always been kind of the lingering question out there. When Capa got to the beach, his first photo was negative 29 out of what would be a total of 38 from that roll of film. And we've got no idea what was on the preceding 28 images. Probably pictures of them approaching the beach, moving from the chase to the beach, etc. But we don't know. And in his book, when Capa was pretending he landed at 6:30, he pretended that it was too dark to take photos that period. But again, that was written 3 years later when he was trying to work around the first wave with Company E and the lab accident stories. So we don't know what he really thought on that.
So the whole darkroom thing, in the book, of course, you dismantled that, and others have too. You're right. It makes no sense. But what, you mentioned a moment ago, there were other photos. What do you think happened to them? How do we account for that?
Well, now, after he got on the LCI, and for the rest of the day, he was working off a different camera, his Rolleiflex, and he took 60 photos of those. So we have most of the negatives in that. So that's kind of a separate group. But as far as the landing photos, it's just speculation. Capa was not in good favor with the censors. He'd been involved in the Norden bomb site security leak. He'd taken photos of B-17s early in the war and inadvertently captured an image of the Norden bomb site. Didn't go through the censors. He passed it directly to his editor. His editor put it on the front page, and they printed 400,000 copies. And they had to destroy all those. And Capa faced an inquest about why was this enemy alien, Hungary was part of the Axis at that point. Why was this enemy alien taking pictures of the Norden bomb site? And that delayed him getting accredited for weeks and perhaps even months. So when the photos got back to London, they didn't go to the lab initially. They went to the censors for initial review. And the censors were supposed to take a look at the caption notes. Well, Capa neglected to fill out caption notes for any of his D-Day landings. So you got this film coming in from a guy who's already got a bad reputation. It's got no caption notes. So they decided, in my opinion, to treat it as a temporary as top secret. They had a mechanism for things that they thought might be too sensitive. And that would put it in the hands of a custody officer, and he'd take it back to the news agency lab, and he would oversee it being developed with nobody else present in the darkroom. And that, I think, accounts for why John Morris had no idea what happened in his darkroom that day, because he couldn't go in there for it. The censors took the film back and for review. And we had Operation Fortitude going on. We were trying to convince the Germans that D-Day was just the preliminary diversionary operation, and the big landing at Pas-de-Calais would happen later the summer. And the censors were really throttling back what images got through and what stories got through. If you take a look at the images that made it to the media in the days after D-Day, there weren't many, and they didn't show very much. They were very vague. So my belief is that the photos Capa took on the way in just showed too much of the size and the scope of the invasion. The few photos that did make it through showed only a couple landing craft. There were thousands of landing craft out there that day. So what did make it through is it looked like the invasion was stalled at the beach. You had casualties, you had a sinking ship, you had guys being loaded into body bags. There's rack, ruin, and destruction. So all the words were, we've landed and hoorah, hoorah, the kind of things you'd expect. But the visual images of the record that the German open source intelligence would look at was very muted. They were so tight on security that when Life published its first edition after the landings, they had a comment in their text that said, hey, just be aware that everything we're reporting is coming from the German sources because Schaeff isn't telling us anything. And that's how tight security was at the time.
And wasn't there, you mentioned, there's no captions. Wasn't there then a disconnect, like at the New York level of Life magazine excitedly looking at Capa's photos and saying, "Oh, this is first wave." I mean, it obviously, because they don't know any better. And I mean, isn't that where that comes from more so than Capa misrepresenting it at the time? Now later, of course, slightly out of focus, he does. So is that a fair representation?
It is. The film arrived, and an assistant editor there, he had the job of putting captions on it, and he didn't know any better. He probably had an idea of generally what had happened on Omaha Beach, and the news there was not really good. I mean, they understood how bad the first day was, and so he incorporated that stuff in it, and he put some marketing spin in there. I mean, we're Life magazine. We've got the best reporters. We've got the best photographers. If they're going to be anywhere, they're going to be at the point of the spear. So there's a little bit of good brand pushing there. But they originated the landing of the first wave thing. And they were very specific when they were talking about waves. They weren't talking about the wave in the general sense of the first regiment in or the first day's landings. They were talking about the first group of boats in. So, but that fit pretty well with Capa's self-groomed image. And so he embraced it in his book, and he linked it to landing with Company E, that fictional story. So, Capa was an interesting character. He's the kind of guy that in his helmet he had written "the greatest war photographer in the world." Now that was a quote that came from another paper that had published his photos, who were, again, marketing hype. And he's also talked about the greatest lover in the world. He's that kind of guy. And as you know, those kind of guys fall into one of two categories. They're the people you don't talk to, or the people that have just great charm, and you just love it because it's not serious, but that's just the way they are, and you're just kind of swept along. He's a great raconteur, always telling stories, and they're always outlandish. A little bit of Munchausen there. So he was quite a legitimate character. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He was an interesting figure.
And Charles, even though there are not very many photos, he is this iconic figure, and we do think of those images when we think of D-Day. It kind of reminds me of Joe Rosenthal with the flag raising at Iwo Jima. This iconic photo that's a little different than when you get to the backstory, but it's still this iconic photo that really defines that particular battle. So how would you then, in the end, how do we remember Robert Capa? And beyond embellishing his legend and glossing over some of these inconvenient facts, what did he do right as a wartime photographer?
He had a good body of work. There's no denying that. I do have to think that say though that you have to carefully look at his images to make sure that what you're seeing is what you say, or they say. You just can't believe the captions. There's one famous image of two troops hustling across the street in a little village, and it looks like they're under fire. Well, that's been cropped. The full image showed another guy sitting on a cart looking just exhausted there. So we don't know why these two guys were hustling. Maybe their sergeant was screaming at them, but you got to understand that pictures are cropped to tell the story that the news story or the magazine wants told. So you can't really actually believe everything as it's presented or the caption. Now, Capa had some great photos on the beach, but they're only the 10, and there's so few from the beach that they've become iconic almost by default, and we're never going to get those out of the public image, and nor should we. But it's always best to kind of understand the context. Now, my personal belief is his best photos were taken when he finally did do a parachute jump across the Rhine River with, I think it's 17th Airborne Division.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. And that to me has a lot of feelings of genuine action as he wandered around the drop zone and the organization. They weren't spectacular, but they were honest. And as a broken down old infantryman, to me, they resonate a lot more than. But they're not the kind that newspapers normally love. Newspapers will love much more of the ones that we see on the screen here. So. Yeah.
And of course, that was Operation Varsity, and that was no walkover. That was a pretty dangerous drop for some of those guys. That was in March 1945. So yeah, the book is called Back into Focus by Charles Herrick. Let me put it there. There we go. Tremendous read for anyone who's interested, certainly in Omaha Beach, the nuts and bolts of Omaha Beach, especially in the early hours of D-Day, but also a really interesting exploration of war photography, reportage, journalism, ethics, and a kind of iconic figure. And, ultimately the reader can decide what he or she thinks. You've stated your position really well, and I know there's all sorts of people who push back and who are anti-Capa, pro-Capa, whatever. I mean, he's a lightning rod on some level too. But I think you've really gotten to the heart of it, and we really enjoyed the book, and we appreciate you sitting down with us today, Charles.
Well, that means a lot to me. Thank you very much.
And
it's very nice meeting all of you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much. John Long, please tell us today's We Salute You.
Today on our We Salute You feature, I would like to zoom in on that question of reporters on the beaches and honor the service of Peter M. Paris, a gifted young soldier who was a reporter for Yank magazine and who fell on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Peter Milton Paris was born in 1913 in Brooklyn, the son of Polish immigrants who spoke primarily Yiddish. He attended the legendary Boys High School in Brooklyn, which, by the way, was the same high school attended by Aaron Copland, Isaac Asimov, Howard Cosell, and hosts of other luminaries. And in high school, he excelled in his studies and achieved a reputation as an artist. He then went on to earn a degree in fine arts from Syracuse University and start a career as an illustrator. However, of course, in 1941, he was drafted into the U.S. Army and was posted to Fort Belvoir with the Corps of Engineers, and where he illustrated the base newspaper. Of course, war came to the U.S. by the end of that year, and in 1942, an interesting opportunity appeared for the talented young artist. An Army officer named Egbert White had proposed a new publication for soldiers that would be written by and for the enlisted man, in contrast to Stars and Stripes, which some privates thought concentrated a little too much on the brass. Yank magazine, as it came to be called, would become an institution in this new war for the grunts in combat boots. In the inaugural issue, President Roosevelt noted that the new publication cannot be understood by our enemies. It is inconceivable to them that a soldier should be allowed to express his own thoughts. The first man to report for duty on the editorial board of Yank magazine was Sergeant Peter Paris. Paris went on to a varied career with Yank, acting as a writer, photographer, and illustrator in the European theater. He covered combat operations in North Africa and Sicily, and made history by being the first Army reporter to write a cover story about an African-American unit. By 1944, he was embedded with the 1st Infantry Division in the headquarters Special Troops and was assigned to land on a beach codenamed Omaha. By most accounts, Sergeant Paris stepped on a landmine on June 6, 1944, and has had his leg nearly severed. What happened next, however, is a bit murkier. Many versions of his story say that he was evacuated to an LST and that the LST was subsequently sunk by German fire in the channel with the loss of all aboard. However, there's simply no such sinking of an LST that occurred on D-Day. Furthermore, records of the American Battle Monuments Commission indicate Paris was buried in the temporary cemetery in France, which of course became the iconic Normandy American Cemetery, which suggests that he never left France alive. And that further, ABMC reports that his remains were repatriated and buried in New York after the war. Whichever version is most accurate, the talented photographer and artist was dead, one of more than 300 men to fall from the Big Red One on D-Day. Peter Paris is remembered at the National D-Day Memorial on plaque W85 of our necrology wall. He's also memorialized in Bayeux, France, at the Memorial Day Reporters, which honors journalists killed in combat zones around the world. Sergeant Peter Paris, we salute you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for doing your part to save the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought he bled to death on the beach from a wound that bad, but I don't know. I mean, that's what stands to reason. It also shows that these reporters were right there, many of them, and I mean, they're seeing combat, and they're making this sacrifice too. And I would say this: Yank Magazine has endured today. It's just a great resource for understanding soldiers in World War II. They nailed it in terms of getting the soldier's voice.
It is absolutely, and you could make a distinction, of course, between the civilian journalists and photographers like Capa and the soldiers who were photographers or writers like Peter Paris. But in the end of the day, they're doing a very important work for a public at home that was desperate for any kind of news, especially any kind of image of what it was like. This is the most anticipated event of the war in 1944, and many people, thought, "Is my son there? What's he going through? What's he seeing? What's he experiencing?" And I think it's hard for us in this day and age when we have 24-hour news cycles, we have instantaneous images from across the globe. It's hard for us to understand how important that was for the audience.
Absolutely. And it's a mass media age. I mean, if you think about it, we're 80 years beyond World War II, and, we've got our 24/7 cycle and social media and all that stuff. They're 80 years, think about what was 80 years before then. It's Civil War era, which is a mass media age of its own, but very different. And in terms of the imagery, the World War II generation expected a lot of imagery, a lot of moving pictures and photographic images that were going to convey the actual event. And maybe that's a little bit of the backdrop to what happens with Capa's photos and the expectations surrounding them. So, yeah, interesting discussion. So our guest today, again, has been Charles Herrick, author of Back into Focus. The subtitle is The Real Story of Robert Capa's D-Day. Charles, it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down with you. We're honored to have you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, truly a pleasure. Well, you can email our team at podcast@dday.org. Again, that's podcast@dday.org. We love hearing from you. If you're enjoying our discussions on World War II and its lasting impact, please subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends, rate it, leave us a review, give us feedback. We enjoy hearing from you. Help us share the lessons and legacies of D-Day and World War II. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care.